Welcome into the Whole Hog Podcast, a special reaction edition of the Whole Hog Podcast. Seth Campbell joined alongside Scotty Bordelon and Matt Jones. And guys, it's the middle of August, and finally, this just feels right. After all of the weirdness and the abnormalities of the past few months, it's the middle of August, and we're talking about football. For a certain extent, this just feels right.
Yeah, to a certain extent. Uh, I'm just glad that we've got that we've got something, kind of hands on to talk about now. For 5 months, there's not been any practices. There've been some walkthrough type deals and drills since I guess about July, but it feels nice to finally have a schedule to talk about, something concrete, and practice beginning Monday. Now we've got practice to talk about, and I know that some of the leagues have given up on football for this year, but it sure feels like the SEC and the Big 12 and the ACC are kind of locked arm in arm, and they're going into this, without any intention of looking back.
Yeah, just although we're doing interviews on Zoom now, and that's kind of the norm, it's going to be the norm going forward. It felt pretty good, and to me anyway, to just kind of be doing those interviews again, like late in the evenings after practice wrapped up, and hearing some of the cliches that guys talk about after practice. Guys were flying around to the ball. Energy was really good. Grant Morgan is apparently bringing the juice still at linebacker. So it's good to hear some of that stuff too, and uh, just kind of, I guess, just picking through the weeds and kind of figuring out what this season might entail for Arkansas. So I mean, just hearing from Sam Pittman and a couple players last night was kind of refreshing.
And the schedule was released yesterday, and the Razorbacks knew who they were going to play because the SEC network and really the Southeastern Conference as a whole is just milking this entire thing. They released the two opponents a few weeks ago and now have released the full schedule. And Arkansas is going to have a tough task to start off the season and to start off Sam Pittman's head coaching career, as he's going to go to his former team or play his former team in Fayetteville. Matt, what do you make of Arkansas's first game against Georgia?
Well, the chances were they were going to play a really good team that first game. And especially a team that's better than them. When you're 1-24 in your last 25 SEC games and been kind of sitting down at the bottom of the SEC for a few years, every game's pretty tough. And when they added Georgia and Florida as their two new teams from the SEC East, it made it to where 6 of their 10 games were against teams that are ranked in the top half of the coaches poll. So there's always that. There was always going to be a strong likelihood that they were going to open the season with somebody uh, highly ranked, and maybe even a top 10 team, given that Georgia and LSU and Alabama and Florida are all in the top 8 this year. So uh, it's a good way to open the season in terms of just figuring out where you are against what's supposed to be one of the best teams in the country. Georgia's got some question marks. They've got to replace their starting quarterback from the last 3 years, Jake Fromm. Of course, they lost their leading running back from last season, lost 3 linemen to the NFL draft, including a couple of first rounders. They've got some coaching changes. Todd Monken is in as their offensive coordinator now. Scott Fountain, who had been their special teams coordinator, he's come over to Arkansas with Sam Pittman, and they actually replaced him with Scott Cochran, who was the strength coach for Alabama for all those years under Nick Saban. So, obviously Georgia's going to be highly favored to win that game. But hey, if there's ever a time to, pull off this type of upset, I'm not saying Arkansas's going to be able to do that. But I think early in the season and a year that's kind of weird like this, maybe there's that maybe it's ripe for a game that people don't expect you to have. Certainly, Georgia's a much more talented team than Arkansas, but I think it'll be really good to see Arkansas get to play a really good team and just see exactly where they are right off the bat. There's none of this playing Portland State early in the season, and then you have to wait till week 2 or week 3 to see how you really stack up. This is the season opener, and it kind of reminds me a little bit of the 2014 season opener when they played Auburn. Auburn was coming off of the national championship game where they lost to Florida State. Arkansas, a similar situation, had not won an SEC game the year before, it was a good way to see where you are to start off that year, and I think it's going to be a similar way this year.
What do you think, Scotty?
Yeah, I think Matt made a good point about just playing a team like Georgia early in the season. According to one random casino in Pennsylvania, I think Georgia is favored by 24 points. And closer we get to the season, there's probably going to be some people trying to talk themselves into Arkansas maybe covering that. Yeah, I mean, I think it's unique too that Arkansas gets to start the season at home with a conference game. I don't know the last time really that Arkansas started, um, started playing conference, and their first game was at home. Somebody might have to fill me in on that, but yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting game. And Bumper Pool and Rakeem Boyd both said that Arkansas is already kind of preparing for Georgia in the sense that Sam Pittman is playing the Georgia fight song at practice, and so the however many weeks leading up to the game, they're probably going to be tired of hearing that, and probably going to be ready to go. But yeah, just Georgia losing its starting quarterback in Jake Fromm, and then DeAndre Swift from last year. I think there's maybe some question marks with those two positions, but they've got like a 5-way battle at quarterback. And Georgia's probably going to have somebody pretty talented fill in at that running back position. And I don't really understand the talk that maybe Sam Pittman's going to absolutely know what Georgia's got coming just because he was there last year. Like there's going to be so many changes. There's already been plenty of changes, and it's not like Georgia's going to roll out the exact same thing that they did last year. And Sam Pittman's going to be able to predict anything that Georgia does. But pretty interesting start to the season, I'd say.
And even if you know what's coming, there's still such a talent gap between Arkansas and Georgia that Arkansas would probably have to play just a perfect game in order to pull off that victory. But I think this year is such a weird year, guys, because it's so hard to predict because, and I'm talking about maybe from Arkansas standpoint initially, you've got a first-year coach. Is this team really as bad as they have been the last 2 years, or were they bad as a result of being poorly coached? And will this new coaching staff, which we all believe that it was an upgrading in coaching staff, head coach, there's some uncertainty there because Sam Pittman's never been a head coach before, but Barry Odom, very respected as a defensive coordinator. Kendall Briles, real respected as an offensive coordinator. And you couldn't say the same, I don't think, necessarily about their predecessors. Yes, John Chavis had a lot of success, but he hadn't had success in a while before he took the job at Arkansas. Had really struggled, in his years at A&M. So you think that their coaching has taken a step up this season. But going back to it being a difficult year to predict, what happens when half a team is out in quarantine? That changes how things look. I mean, you guys remember the Arkansas-Missouri game last year when several players had the mumps and how that affected that game. And, I think we're going to see a lot of, or we could potentially see, some cases like that this season where a team comes in and maybe there's an outbreak within that team and all of a sudden there's 20 players who can't play that Saturday. And so I think that makes it really hard to predict. And then I think what we're looking at in terms of how many people are able to attend games, does anybody really have a true home field advantage this year?
Right.
And so I just think that I can't remember a year, at least from Arkansas's perspective, where it's been this difficult to predict. And then you add in on top of that the fact that they're not playing any non-conference games, and so there really aren't any games where you say, yeah, they'll probably win that one. I don't think you can say that about any of these 10 games.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Matt. Scotty raised the question. I think, Matt, you did the legwork and the research on this, that Arkansas has never opened up their season against a conference opponent at home.
In Fayetteville, they played Baylor in Little Rock in 1958. That was actually Frank Broyles' first game. Lost to Baylor 12-0 in Little Rock. But this will only be the fourth time that Arkansas has ever played a conference opponent to lead off a season. Played Baylor in 58, lost at Texas to start off the 1980 season, and then 6 years ago played at Auburn to start the 2014 season. Like I said earlier, that this feels a lot like that Auburn matchup. other than the fact that Arkansas is getting to play this one at home and played Auburn down in Alabama. But just in the fact that Georgia, like Auburn in 2014, was coming off of a division championship, and Arkansas, like in 2014, is coming off a season when they didn't win any conference games. And so there wasn't a lot expected of Arkansas in that 2014 game at Auburn. And it actually ended up being a pretty darn good game until a rainstorm came, and Auburn pulled away after the restart. But it'll be interesting to see how this one goes. But it feels a lot like that 2014 game against Auburn, at least for me.
So you got the schedule that goes Georgia at Mississippi State, at Auburn, and then Ole Miss, and at Texas A&M. Then Tennessee at Florida, LSU at Missouri, and then end it with Alabama, which is unique that Arkansas is going to play Alabama after Alabama plays Auburn. And then the only game that stayed the same as well is the Missouri game that stayed in the same slot right around the Thanksgiving holiday. So you have all these games, and as Matt mentioned, you're going to have 6 games out of your 10 that are against teams ranked in the top 25 of the coaches poll. Is there a game for Arkansas that you guys see that you can circle and say, hey, this is a key game in the season? We'll start with you, Scotty.
Yeah, I'm kind of looking at week 4 against Ole Miss at home. Ole Miss just hired Lane Kiffin, so we don't necessarily know at this point, what exactly Ole Miss is going to be. Obviously we'll have a better idea, after 3 weeks of the season being played. But I think that's a game that obviously it's at home, and you feel like it's a winnable game. So maybe, if Arkansas goes in there and plays well, you carry some momentum into the bye week, and then, you gotta, I don't know if it's a necessarily a toss-up game. Probably not a toss-up game at Texas A&M, but you seemingly always play Texas A&M pretty tight, regardless if the Aggies are ranked or not. I know a lot of the games in the past have been played on a neutral field, but I think that bye week before you go play Texas A&M, I think that'll be beneficial. I think right now just that October 17th date against the Ole Miss, I think that's one that, if Arkansas can go into, play well, maybe get a positive result out of, maybe that could maybe build up some confidence in this team going into the back half of the season that's not very forgiving.
Yeah, my thought is that Arkansas will break a 20-game conference losing streak at Mississippi State in week 2. And, there's such a big difference between what Mississippi State has been the last several years under Dan Mullen and under Joe Moorhead the last couple of years, and what they're about to try to reestablish themselves as under Mike Leach. And I just think that early in the season, they're going to be coming off a game against LSU. It's going to be Mike Leach's first home game. I really wonder how well Mississippi State is going to look like what Mike Leach wants them to look like at that point in the season. And then his teams don't play defense. And so I think that there's a good chance Arkansas go down into Starkville and beat Mississippi State. And that sounds crazy given the way Mississippi State has beaten them the last couple of years. There's a pretty big talent difference, or there has been, between those two teams. I think that maybe that talent difference is starting to shrink a little bit because Mississippi State, they've been so good on the lines the last few years, but they're starting to lose a lot of those offensive linemen and defensive linemen, guys like Jeffrey Simmons, to the NFL. And so I think Arkansas's got a really good chance of going into Starkville and winning that game in week 2. And I think that's just going to be you play Georgia week 1, you go out there and you see where the chips fall. But I think against Mississippi State in week 2, I think that's going to be a real good indication of where Arkansas is. Because yes, Mississippi State, they've recruited better than Arkansas. They've been more talented the last few years, but I really think that Arkansas has got a chance to go in there just because of that drastic difference in style and the fact that Leach's teams don't play defense. And I think they got a chance to potentially win that game, and that'll be a really good indication, kind of gauge where Arkansas is this year under Sam Pittman.
Yeah, I think Matt made some good points there, just laying out, Mississippi State might not obviously be, 100% what Mississippi State might not be 100% of what Mike Leach wants going into week 2. Also, the home field advantage is going to be way dialed back like drastically. You know what I mean? So it's not like you're going to be going into those. I don't know what the capacity at Mississippi State Stadium is, but less cowbells is obviously I think that's going to be a plus too.
Yeah, I was just thinking that you're not going to have a full stadium of cowbells ringing. Their 25%, if that is indeed what happens, is a lot less cowbells. And, more cowbell, not always the best thing. Guys, as we progress through the schedule, Arkansas's back half after their bye week, and then they go and play Texas A&M. It is loaded with at Texas A&M, Tennessee, at Florida, LSU. You kind of think you have a little bit of a reprieve at Missouri, and then you go and play Alabama. Out of that back half, what game would you say Arkansas, we talked a little bit about the Texas A&M game, Scotty, you did, but what game do you think that Arkansas can circle on that back half and really point to as a place to get another W?
Yeah, I think it's Missouri. Like I got an email today about updated SEC conference odds, and right above Arkansas at 2.5 wins over under. Right above Arkansas is Missouri at 3, and so I think that's probably your best bet for a win in the back half of the schedule. You get the back half of the schedule is really tough. Like Tennessee, you get them at home, but Tennessee I feel like is on the up and up. LSU at home to Alabama to end the season. At Florida is not going to be easy, obviously either. But the one thing I do kind of like about the back half of Arkansas' schedule is you don't have a couple of road games stacked on top of each other. A couple of those tough, physical, smash mouth road games stacked back-to-back weeks, that can be kind of damaging to a team's psyche. And obviously that's not the case with the back half of this schedule. Obviously the opponents aren't easy either, but if Arkansas can. I just like that there's not really just two really, really tough road games stacked in the back half of that schedule. I think that's pretty solid for Arkansas.
I think that's the way throughout the whole schedule. I mean, there's really not those 2 weeks where you say, man, that's going to be really tough until you get down toward the end of the season. They play Florida, LSU. I mean, you start the season with Georgia, but then, you kind of counterbalance that with Mississippi State, Auburn, then you get Ole Miss. And so I think that if you look beyond the fact that they had to add Georgia and Florida to their schedule, I think that there is a little bit of balance to this schedule, just in the fact that, there are some points within this schedule where it feels like maybe you can breathe a little bit. Again, you're the worst team in the SEC playing a schedule full of SEC teams, but it's not like you're playing Georgia and then LSU and then Alabama in consecutive weeks. And so I think that, the schedule does favor Arkansas, in that regard somewhat. In terms of the games on the back half of the schedule, there's a couple that I think are kind of interesting. And the first is Texas A&M. You got to remember, Arkansas is coming off 2 straight years where they were 2-10, didn't win a conference game, and they took A&M to the brink both times. There's something about that matchup. It's just a good matchup for Arkansas. It has been. Now, they haven't won it. But what I mean by a good matchup is that it's been a matchup that, they've been able to be competitive in when they really haven't been competitive with a lot of other teams, maybe outside of like an Ole Miss. The Texas A&M series has been pretty competitive. And then I think the Tennessee game is kind of interesting. You talked about, what Sam Pittman knows about Georgia. Well, Jim Chaney and Sam Pittman are old buddies, and he's the offensive coordinator at Tennessee. And if I'm a defensive coordinator like Barry Odom, who already knows Tennessee quite well because of his past at Missouri, and I've got someone sitting there with me and a head coach who knows those tendencies of an offensive coordinator quite well. I think that's kind of an interesting matchup when Tennessee comes to Fayetteville, and then, like you guys said, the Missouri game. Missouri's been a lot better than Arkansas the last few years, and since they started playing each other when Missouri joined the SEC, I think Arkansas is 1-5 in that series. But the fact that Missouri is kind of in the same position as Arkansas, the fact that these two teams are going to probably be really beaten up by the time they get to that game, given that Missouri kind of got the Western Division equivalent of what Arkansas got from the East. That'll be an interesting game to watch at the end of the season.
Yeah, I think it's also fitting that Arkansas and Texas A&M are playing on Halloween. I think it's kind of, I expect that. I think that game's probably going to be pretty wild. It wouldn't surprise me in the least if that comes down to maybe the final possession, just like a bunch of the games in the past have.
I wonder if we've seen the last of the Arkansas A&M game in Arlington. I know that Hunter Yurachek has said that they want to move that series back there in a couple of years. Anticipating that because A&M got the game in College Station this year, that Arkansas wants to get a game in Fayetteville. A&M doesn't like that series there, guys. And I think in talking to Hunter Yurachek, I get the sense that he likes playing in Arlington, but I'm not sure he likes playing A&M in Arlington because that's as he told me a couple of months ago, that's a premium home game that gets taken out of Fayetteville every other year.
Absolutely.
So I really wonder if we've seen the last of Arkansas and A&M down in Arlington, and I wonder what Arkansas's future might look like in that stadium. You've got to believe that Arkansas is going to have somewhat of a presence there. I don't know that you're going to see them have an every year presence there anymore. But it'll be interesting to see what Arkansas and AT&T Stadium's partnership becomes in the next few years, because I kind of feel like when Arkansas and A&M moved that series to campuses for the first couple of years that the Aggies were in the SEC, there was always that knowledge in the back of your mind that they wanted to get back to Arlington and play. And they began an 11-year series back in Arlington in 2014. It doesn't feel like the two decision makers, Hunter Yurachek and Ross Bjork, are full-throated in their support of getting that series back in Arlington. And so it'll be interesting to see, now that the cat's out of the bag and they're going to go back to the campuses, is that something you can ever really put back in the bag for a few years? Because it's a monetary gain for both of those teams. I think they make about $3 million a piece by playing down there. But that's you compare that maybe to what you get for one home game. And I think maybe one home game every other year is more beneficial to those teams than a couple of neutral site games. Even a neutral site game in a year where you'd be the away team otherwise.
It'd be interesting to see how that progresses moving forward. If Arkansas maybe wants to have a footprint with some of their old conference rivals in the SWC down there in Dallas and in that area for non-conference games. We saw them travel to TCU for home and home with TCU a few years ago. So that was a good series as well. So see if maybe something like that can be what Arkansas can incorporate maybe into AT&T Stadium moving forward.
I'm just not sure, Seth, what other old SWC teams are going to be interested in that type of series. Texas Tech and Baylor have played each other in Arlington some over the years. That's probably the series that's been played there the most, other than Arkansas and A&M. But Texas is not going to want to play a series in AT&T Stadium. I don't see any of the other Big 12 teams, really wanting to do that. And then you look at the teams that aren't Arkansas and A&M or aren't in the Big 12. I mean, is Arkansas Rice isn't going to move the needle at that stadium. Arkansas SMU, probably not. If Houston is having a good year, maybe you get something like that. But as people have told me, Houston is more of a commuter type school where the people, they'll support them in Houston, but you get outside of Houston and the support's really not as strong. And so I don't know what it looks like there. I wonder about some of these future games that Arkansas's got on the schedule. Oklahoma State's a team that seems to really value their presence in Dallas too. Maybe does that series get moved there for a couple of years? Or we've seen BYU play some teams in AT&T Stadium. Arkansas is supposed to play BYU a couple of times coming up in the next few years. And so again, I think it's really interesting. I think it's going to be really interesting to see what the fallout of that Arkansas A&M game moving away from Arlington is going to be, because I've really got my doubts that Arkansas is going to have an annual presence in Arlington moving forward. Maybe they will. Maybe A&M will agree to play those final 3 years down there. But I've got my doubts now that the cat's out of the bag, like I said earlier.
All right, guys, one last question before we wrap it up here on the WholeHog Podcast. So Arkansas, when the schedule was released and the extra opponents were released as well, you kind of think that Arkansas got the short end of the stick by adding Florida and Georgia to their schedule. If you had to look through the schedule, I guess one positive that you could pull out of this that I thought was kind of interesting is who the Arkansas's opponent plays before that they will play Arkansas. So if you think about it, Tennessee gets a bye and A&M gets a bye before they play Arkansas. But if you look at the rest of how the schedule plays out, before the Arkansas plays Alabama, they get Auburn. Before Arkansas plays Auburn, Auburn plays Georgia. Before Arkansas plays Florida, Florida gets Georgia. Before Arkansas plays LSU, LSU gets Alabama. Before Arkansas plays Ole Miss gets Alabama. And before Arkansas plays Mississippi State plays LSU. So while you did get the short end of the stick on which teams you actually got, it does seem like the schedule works out a little bit in favor of the Razorbacks in the terms of who their opponent plays before they play the Razorbacks. Does that have any effect on how teams play each other moving throughout the season, Matt?
I don't know if it does. I've always heard of that, that Alabama effect, but and this has been a few years since I've looked into this, but I looked into this a few years ago, and it was actually a deal where teams, after they played Alabama, won more times than they lost when they played their next conference game, or played a conference game the next week. I know that there's been some thought that Arkansas was able to get LSU a couple of times when LSU might have had a hangover from losing to Alabama, but I don't know. Maybe on a one-off occasion, you might be able to get a team a little bit down from the week before. Obviously playing Alabama, that can have a physical toll on a team, or a team like Georgia, who's very similar to Alabama in terms of how physical they play. But I don't know. It's I tend to think that maybe fans make a little bit more of a deal out of that than the numbers really bear out.
What do you think, Scotty?
Yeah, I think Matt pretty much covered it. My biggest takeaway is just I'm glad that Arkansas's bye week fell on my wife's birthday, so I feel like I'm going into the season with a win already. And then the second part is just the back half of the schedule, even though it's tough, there's no two tough road games back to back. That's just kind of my main takeaway. You got to go to A&M, which is a tough game. You got another tough. I mean, all these games are tough, but Tennessee at home, you feel better. I think you obviously feel better about your chances in that game with it being at home. I think, like I said earlier, it can just really damage a team's mentality and their psyche with a couple of tough road games back to back. But didn't work out, didn't pan out that way this year. So I think Arkansas, I think the schedule it sets up probably as good as it could have.
All right, gentlemen. Well, thank you so much for your time here on the WholeHog Podcast. Once again, that's Matt Jones and Scotty Bordelon, both writers for WholeHogSports.com. You can check out all of their great coverage of fall camp, and as we move closer towards the season of their football coverage on WholeHogSports.com. I am Seth Campbell saying thank you for joining us, and we will see you back here later this week for the WholeHog Podcast.